Hi friends, welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant Wilhelm. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. I had always gone my own way. I had never forced myself, but rather set my mind unreservedly to doing what I considered necessary. I had also helped others in a comradely manner whenever I could. Coming from a simple farming family, I had pursued my military career not through nepotism or intrigues, but rather through diligence, punctuality, reliability, and efficiency. I believe that I always had a heart for subordinate soldiers and officers, and I was also no coward when things were hard. This all belonged doubtlessly to my straight way. Since the Battle of Destruction on the Volga, especially after the talks that I had had in captivity with men like Professor Arnold, Wilhelm Pieck, and Lieutenant Colonel Pusyrov, not least through my studying of literature, thinking and pondering, the realization grew that in my straight way my self-deception had reached an important point. I had been cheated of any real goal along this route, over the for what and the where to. As a soldier I obeyed orders blindly. My supreme commander, however, was Adolf Hitler, in whose hands lay immense power, an abundance of power that no German head of state had held since Kaiser Wilhelm II. This power was enforced by violence, through which the political enemies of National Socialism, communists, social democrats, liberals, and Christians, were locked up in concentration camps, liquidated in cold blood, or brought to the scaffold. The majority of the people were, with the help of a cunning national and social demagogy, participating in a coordinated economic phantom existence aimed at armament. Guns, tanks, bombers, fighters, submarines, and battleships were sprung from the ground. The army, air force, and navy were growing, and Hitler was becoming ever more arrogant, threatening, and powerful. Germany was spreading an atmosphere of fear and horror in the world. Never was the Führer Teutonicus as much feared by other peoples as in the first 10 years of the Third Reich. When Hitler's Germany believed itself militarily strong enough, it over in neighboring countries, conquered them, utilized them to the utmost, and annexed them. Then came the change, which started with the defeat of the Wehrmacht and the Soviet Union during the winter of 1941-42, and was completed with the destruction of the Sixth Army on the Volga and the defeat at Kursk in the summer of 1943. No less than half a year had now passed since the last night in the cauldron, the night of the 30th/31st January 1943, when I had brooded over the questions. When did the tragedy on the Volga begin? What was my life? Germany's luck or misfortune? Now I saw things much more clearly. Above all, it was clear that Hitler's unscrupulous power and war policies were only possible because his generals had served him faithfully, obeyed him blindly, and actively assisted him, as I had done on my straight way. Thus, Hitler had been able to continue the pitiless war of conquest that was now striking back at the German people in frightful retribution. Hitler and his regime had undermined all the ethical and lawful practices of conduct between state leadership and the people, between the command of the Wehrmacht and the Wehrmacht itself. While Heitz, Schmidt, von Arnim, and other generals still regarded him as the faithful one, they were bringing severe blame on themselves, not only for the disaster that could already be seen, but for everything in particular that the Moloch of war had conjured up. My straight way now obliged me to distance myself from the generals who had produced such an undignified paper, and whose anger against the search for a new evaluation and a new orientation was out of all proportion. In their inflexibility, it seemed they would rather leave the world in rubble than deal with it realistically. I was ashamed of myself after the event for having signed the corpse spirit under the damned collective condemnation against the leading speaker for the League of German Officers. I would never do that again. I undertook basically as before to engage myself with the work and aims of the proposed League of German Officers. Unfortunately, at this time my health was somewhat unstable and I was in the care of the doctors because of a circulatory problem. As therapy, I would have to do some light work, I thought. But that was not so easy for a staff officer or a general. The Soviet Union adhered to the Geneva Convention of 1929, according to which officers were exempt from physical labor. The Soviet camp doctor, Dr. Morov, understood my reasoning and arranged for me to have an area of grass in the park, which I then dug up with some of the generals. The doctor provided some seeds. Soon I was able to supplement our meals with salads, carrots, cucumbers, and herbs. The gardening helped in as much as I regained my body weight, which had been considerably reduced as a result of the troubles and deprivations in the big battle. Mainly, I thank the quiet care of the camp doctor, Dr. Morov, for getting me through my health crisis. But as an allotment gardener, I did not lose out on the spiritual role. In this, I got myself into many controversies. I remained a busy user of the camp library. A great impression was made on me by Lenin's work Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Nikolai Ostrovsky's How the Steel Was Hardened, Shalichov's New Land Under Plow, Alexei Tolstoy's Bread and Gladkov Energy. All these helped me to recognize the deeply affecting upheavals which the Soviet Union had allowed to evolve from the rubble of the old Tsarist Russia. These books answered several of the questions that had arisen in my mind during the advance of the Sixth Army the year before, concerning the scientific laboratory in the steppe village, the mighty factories in Stalingrad, the fighting workmen of the tractor factory. Above all, the question that I had often asked myself: what gave the Soviet soldier so much steadfastness, courage, and fighting spirit, and the attributes that so astounded us and demanded such heavy casualties? Gradually I understood that the Soviet man was conscious of the need to defend his fatherland, of conducting a justified fight against the enemy who, without declaring war, had breached a treaty and fallen on the Soviet Union on the 22nd June 1941 in order to annex the socialist state and society. In all these deliberations I found in Lieutenant Colonel Pusterov a ready conversationalist and patient teacher. From him I learned that Soviet soldiers and officers alike were on the whole brought up with political knowledge. They should know the whole truth about what was happening in the world around them. Every Red Army soldier, said Pusterov, knows, for example, the Soviet Union's war aims. The Red Army is fighting to drive the German invaders out of our land and to free the Soviet soil. Our fight for freedom mixes with the fighting of the people of Europe and America for their independence, for their democratic freedoms. Our war will lead to the destruction of the Hitler clique. We Soviet people nevertheless differentiate between the Hitler system and the German people. Hitler will and must be destroyed, but we hope to be able to live in friendship with the German people once more. Understand, Colonel Adam, that this is our policy. I nodded without a word. But what are the war aims of Hitler's Wehrmacht? They want not only to rob our land and our riches, but are destroying hundreds of thousands of women, children, and old people. The Soviet man is to be a sub-person, stamped as of a lower race. Think of the Commissar order. Think of the fascist mass murders that have been organized in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and in other countries, and that millions of our people have been transported to Germany to do forced labor. In view of such fascist crimes, is it not obvious where the subhumans are to be found? It is terrible, Lieutenant Colonel Pusterov. How can we Germans get out of this filth, out of this wrong? You can do it, you two, Colonel Adam, but you must change your views radically and not just think differently. You must fight for it, so that this filthy episode in the history of the German people at least ends quickly, and a new, better Germany can be formed. I think you should begin with your own responsible political thinking and dealing to learn, and not wait for a higher rank or for orders. That is easier said than done. Do you know that in the Kaiser's army, as in the Reichswehr, the Wehrmacht, the soldier had to be unpolitical? Every political activity was forbidden to him. I know that. Many Germans say that politics will ruin a man's character. You have hit upon a remark by the great Goethe. Political song, a ghastly song. But I believe that in this case one leaves Goethe well to one side. Perhaps you are now thinking about the role of politics in your life, especially in the battle of destruction at Stalingrad. You have experienced the consequences of fascist politics painfully in your own life. Was it not a paradox that I should be taking such lessons from a staff officer in the enemy army? I admit openly that I am still thankful today to Pusterov and to all those who helped me to sort out my problems and to get involved in thinking in a new way. Without them, the way to the new shores would have been tedious and painful. By means of such talks, and through studying the literature I gradually saw that the series of German defeats in the Soviet Union were not primarily the result of strategic and tactical errors by the German military command, although there were errors in abundance, but rather were the lawful result of the overwhelming Soviet war leadership and the fighting morale of the Red Army, as well as the patriotism of the Soviet people and their determination to defend their homeland, who won the fight through their increasing output of weapons, ammunition, and supplies for the front. These factors began to play an ever greater role during the winter of 1941-42 as the Soviet Union overcame the surprise of the German onslaught, so from 1942 onwards, they were able to exploit the full mobilization of all their forces. The first great result of this was the German defeat on the Volga and the collapse of the Southern Front in 1942-43. Again, the waves rose in Volkovo camp as the news spread of the founding of the League of German Officers. On the 11th and 12th September 1943, more than 100 delegated officers from 5 countries, as well as members of the National Committee Freies Deutschland and a row of guests, gathered in Lunyovo near Moscow. The severe German disasters on all fronts had given a group of senior officers the last incentive to take part in the Freies Deutschland movement. The initiative of the German Communist Party and its Central Committee, as well as the National Committee, had enabled the officers to found their own organization attached to the Freies Deutschland movement. This had given their movement a wider basis, and it had fallen on fruitful ground. In Volkovo, following the visit of Generals von Seydlitz and Lattmann, Colonel Stiegel, and Major von Frankenberg, we were not unprepared. The condemning verdict had made things quite clear. Now it was known that General von Seydlitz had been voted president of the League of German Officers, with General Edler von Daniels, Colonel Stiegel, and Van Hooven as vice presidents. Major Generals Korfs and Lattmann were also on the committee. In order to ensure constant cooperation between the National Committee and the Board of the League of German Officers, a few days later General von Seydlitz was voted vice president of the National Committee. Apart from this, the National Committee Freies Deutschland was enlarged by Daniels, Lattmann, Korfs, and a few other officers. As we discovered this from the newspaper Freies Deutschland, the cries of the leading group in Volkovo broke out again. They arranged a fresh statement about Seydlitz, Daniels, Korfs, and Lattmann. Old Pfeffer burst out angrily. By doing so, they have finally distanced themselves from us. We will have nothing more to do with them and will boycott them should we meet them. Paulus, von Lenski, Wolves, and I did not agree with this complaint. Paulus looked through it to ensure that he and Pfeffer were not shown as in agreement with the threatened boycott. The League of German Officers turned to tasks and target setting so that a deep consciousness of duty and feeling of responsibility for our people towards every German officer might check the catastrophe threatening Germany. In conformity with the analysis of the National Committee, the League of German Officers declared, "The war has become meaningless and hopeless. Its continuance lies exclusively in the interest of Hitler and his regime. Consequently, the National Socialist government, which is acting against the will of the people and the nation, will never be ready to allow the opening of the way that alone can lead to peace. This recognition forces us to declare a fight against Hitler's criminal regime and for the creation of a government with sufficient means of power with which, as seen from our side, peace and a happy future for our fatherland can be assured." With this special appeal, the 6th Army's surviving combatants turned to the German generals and officers, the people, and the Wehrmacht. All Germany knows what Stalingrad means. We went through hell. We were declared dead and have arisen to a new life. We can no longer say nothing. We have more than anyone the right to speak, not only in our own names, but in the names of our dead comrades and all the victims of Stalingrad. That is our right and our duty. In the newspaper Freies Deutschland, I read with close attention the speech that Major General Lattmann had made at the founding conference of the League of German Officers. He spoke about the oath of allegiance. Like so many others, this question had greatly moved me at the time. Generations of German officers had sworn the oath to the head of state as the highest attribute of a soldier's honor. Were there any grounds that vindicated breaching the oath? Lattmann went from the ethical content of the oath to the relationship between the Führer and the follower that the oath made reciprocally binding. He recalled the order by a commanding general not long before the conclusion of the fighting in the cauldron. The Führer has ordered that we should fight to the last. God orders my men. In this way, tens of thousands fulfilled their oath to the utmost. But how far can this loyalty be taken? If one thinks this loyalty through to the end, said Latman, then one comes to the conclusion. Even if Germany goes under, the oath of allegiance remains undamaged. In this extreme consequence lies the justification for describing the further binding of the oath as immoral. As we are of the view that any further fighting will lead to the destruction of our German people, we see under quite different conditions the oath to the person of Adolf Hitler to be null and void. While Hitler knew that our promise bound us to him, he could contrive plans that must make him the greatest of all Germans. It was for this idea that the expensive blood of our comrades had been sacrificed, not for Germany any longer. Was this not an abuse of our loyalty? Was it not the abusing of a right that he was exploiting from our ethical belief in the wording of the oath? Latman continued, "We never took this oath to make him or ourselves lords of Europe. We swore by God to be entirely loyal if a war for Germany arose. He, however, whose loyalty we praised, turned this oath into a lie. Now, however, we ask our people to be even more compliant." It was a clean, earnest discussion that impressed me deeply. The speeches by Colonel Van Hooven and Steele, as well as that by General von Seydlitz, also had the honorable intention of saving Germany before it was too late. A few days later, the resolution of the National Committee and the Board of the League of German Officers was published. Orderly retreat of the army to the Reich boundaries under responsible leaders contrary to Hitler's orders. This meant that the Wehrmacht should return to the Reich's borders under the command of its generals against Hitler's orders, thus making it known that they distanced themselves from Hitler's plans of conquest, and as the strongest bearers of arms in Germany, wanted to thus return to peace. The National Committee and the League of German Officers constantly repeated their demands of September 1943 by means of loud hailers, leaflets, personal letters, broadcasts, and the newspaper Freies Deutschland. The following appeared in a central leaflet of October 1943. The National Committee has come to the following decision. There is no way of saving the army other than by an orderly withdrawal to the Reich boundaries. However, there can be no orderly withdrawal without the removal of Hitler as supreme commander. The Wehrmacht will pull out of Hitler's army without and against Hitler, or they will not return at all. Therefore, the leadership of the National Committee Freies Deutschland turns to the generals. Demand and proclaim Hitler's removal, the criminalizer of the Reich and Wehrmacht, as commander-in-chief. Take your troops back in an orderly manner. Take care that your soldiers do not take matters into their own hands and flee home demoralized. To the officers and men, demand the immediate withdrawal of the army. Be conscious that you are to be the weapons bearers for the freedom of our new Germany. Complying with this solution meant, both politically and militarily, a great chance for Germany. A national catastrophe would be averted, millions of human victims spared, the destruction of German cities avoided. The world had evidence that in Germany itself there were the strongest forces that could, albeit belatedly, end Hitler's regime and policies. The starting point for a peace treaty and the formation of a new Germany would be incomparably more favorable than would be the case if the war continued. In vain, the National Committee Freies Deutschland and the League of German Officers were heard on the German front and partly also in Germany. Certainly their admonishing words demanded thought, prevented several soldiers and officers in hopeless situations from dying of despair, and refuted both the big-mouthed war reports of the fascist propagandist General Sittmer and Goebbels' lies to the effect that the Soviet army took no prisoners. Yet no great success occurred. The German generals knew as well as the leaders of the National Committee that Germany's military defeat was inevitable, but they continued to follow Hitler's orders out of either fanaticism or a lack of civil courage. Lack of civil courage, political illiteracy, and other dross from the past stopped me too from following my conscience and taking up an active role in the League of German Officers. Just like the Major Generals von Lenski and Wols, with whom I was becoming quite friendly, I agreed with the aims of the National Committee, but we had reservations about the all-encompassing way in which we were being encircled. Lieutenant General Schlömer left Voikovo camp at the beginning of September. This did not come as a surprise to most of us. Schlömer was inseparable from Daniel's day-after-day imprisonment. We called them Max and Moritz. Apparently, both generals had been in sympathy with the Freies Deutschland movement and the League of German Officers for a long time. General Schlömer, as well as General von Druber, participated in the founding assembly of the League as guests. Dear friends, that's all for today. Please support my channel with any comment. Thanks a lot. It was Tim, and see you.